In a world of secrets and alliances, one lawyer finds himself entangled in a nightmare. His wife vanishes with her lover, a police officer, and he's accused of the crime. But as evidence unfolds, a hidden twist challenges everything they think they know. Was he really the villain, or was he set up? Dive into this suspenseful story where betrayal meets cold strategy. I didn't expect my life to take the turns it did, but as a lawyer navigating a world of shadows and backroom deals, nothing stayed simple for long. Back then, I was one of those lawyers you'd only hear about in whispers, known for representing people most lawyers would cross the street to avoid. The deeper I got, the more I learned to embrace the chaos, to see the law not as a tool of justice, but as a game of strategy. And for a while, it worked. I became both wealthy and notorious, building a career on my reputation for navigating the grayest areas of the legal world. But when you live in a world like that, you don't always get to choose who owes you favors or when they'll call them in. One of those debts was to a man named Sergeant Devin Cross, a cop who represented the good side of the law, a real upstanding guy who had somehow found himself on the brink of losing everything. I still remember the day he walked into my office, desperate and carrying foreclosure papers he couldn't afford. Devin wasn't the type of client I'd usually take, but something about his situation got to me. He told me about his family, about his little girl who was fighting cancer, and how he was on the verge of losing their home because of an online scam. A guy like him, strong and honorable, sitting there close to tears, was a rare sight. For reasons I still don't fully understand, I decided to help him. I pulled every string I could, using my network of connections, both the shady and the downright dangerous, to expose the mortgage fraud against him. And with enough influence, I managed to halt the foreclosure and save his home. But that favor, that debt, didn't just go one way. Devin Cross now owed me, and life has a funny way of circling back around. In the years that followed, as my reputation darkened and rumors swirled, Devin's debt was one of the few things keeping me tethered to some shred of humanity. That connection would come back to haunt us both in ways neither of us could have predicted. One night, the inevitable call came. Devin's voice was tense over the phone, telling me he needed to meet and share something critical. I suggested a bar off Route 7, a place called Falcon's Nest, known as a hangout for local cops. A police bar wasn't exactly my usual venue, but it was the last place anyone would expect to find a lawyer like me meeting with an officer. The irony of the choice seemed to suit the situation perfectly, and the crowded, public setting would keep suspicion at bay. I arrived first, and as I stepped in, I felt eyes on me from all sides. The whispers were already out there that I was somehow involved in my wife's disappearance, along with a police detective named Paul Moreno. They had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no evidence, just rumors. And in the minds of everyone in that bar, I was the prime suspect. When Devin walked in, he looked at me with a mix of reluctance and regret. I knew he didn't like this arrangement any more than I did, but the favor he owed me weighed heavily on him. We exchanged pleasantries, his voice stiff, keeping our words light. We sat down, and the waitress brought over 2 Boston beers. Devin glanced around, visibly uncomfortable, and finally leaned in. "They're coming for you," he whispered, barely moving his lips. "They've got a warrant. Your house, your office, early Sunday morning." I forced myself to keep calm, but a cold surge of adrenaline hit me. Devin was giving me the warning, risking his career, and trying to repay his debt. I pushed back my chair with an exaggerated crash and raised my voice so everyone around us could hear. "Look, when I need advice, I'm not going to get it from some street cop," I scoffed, loud enough to make everyone in earshot uncomfortable. "And for the last time, I don't know what happened to my wife." I left him there, stunned, as I stormed out of Falcon's Nest. We both knew what I'd just done. I had given the onlookers something to talk about. They'd assume he'd been pushing for a confession, nothing more. As I stepped out into the night air, a dark feeling settled over me. Devin had risked everything to help, and now I was on borrowed time. But somehow, even under the weight of suspicion and looming searches, I knew I'd have to keep my edge if I was going to survive the storm heading my way. By Sunday morning, I was more than ready. The police raid, just as Devin had warned, came with full force. 4 officers in tactical gear burst into my house at dawn, clearly expecting to catch me asleep or disoriented. Instead, I was wide awake, frying eggs and bacon in the kitchen, the scent of breakfast filling the air as they stormed in. "Hope you guys are hungry," I called, giving them a cold smile as they cuffed my hands and led me outside. They threw me into the back of a police van as I watched them tear into my house, combing through every room, every drawer, like bloodhounds on the scent of a fox. The entire ordeal felt like a twisted invasion, yet I prepared for it, fortified myself mentally for every piece of my life they'd rip apart. They left nothing untouched, ransacking closets, tearing up carpet, and even digging through the flower beds outside. The basement was where they really went to town, ripping through every inch with an almost gleeful ferocity. They seemed to take a particular interest in my car, a plain brown Toyota Camry, a far cry from the flashy sports car my wife's lover had driven. They cracked open the trunk, but of course, they'd find nothing. I'd cleaned up, and I'd cleaned up well. Once they'd exhausted themselves and torn through all they could, some of the officers who knew me, colleagues I'd crossed paths with over the years, extended an invitation to Denny's for breakfast. I accepted. Over pancakes and coffee, they peppered me with thinly veiled questions, fishing for a confession they'd never get. "So, where are the bodies, Bruce?" one of them asked, leaning forward, his eyes glinting with a dark mix of curiosity and contempt. I shrugged, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "As far as I know, there aren't any bodies," I replied casually. "Do you think it'll rain today? I've got some bulbs to plant once this is all over." The officers looked at each other, frustrated by my calm indifference. I knew they were desperate, but without real evidence, they had nothing. And as I drove back to my now-destroyed home, I felt a grim satisfaction. They could tear my life apart, try to shake me, but they'd find nothing. If they wanted to convict me, they'd have to play dirtier than I did. It wasn't long before they came at me with something new, a piece of evidence that, for them, could tip the scales. My wife's diary. They'd found it locked away in her antique desk, the one I'd bought her back when we were young and thought life was simpler. The desk itself was destroyed in their search, and as I heard about it, a strange, hollow feeling crept over me. Memories of our early days together, the plans we'd made, flashed through my mind. But now, those pages were fuel for the fire they wanted to burn me with. Soon enough, the prosecution leaked the juiciest entries to the press. Lines describing her admiration for her lover, Officer Paul Moreno, and the slow breakdown of our marriage were suddenly public knowledge, twisted to paint a narrative that cast me as the possessive, jealous husband. The news ran wild with it, transforming Elaine's entries into a tragic romance, the devoted social worker and her daring police lover, brought down by her dangerous husband. The courtroom was packed with spectators, eager for any salacious detail. I watched from my seat as a young paralegal stood at the witness stand, reading each diary entry in a somber voice. "I love Bruce deeply," she'd written. "But Paul makes me feel something I haven't felt in years." I listened as her private thoughts, her confessions, were paraded in front of the jury. Each entry felt like a slap, and I saw the jurors shift uncomfortably, drinking in every detail. The prosecution was thrilled, convinced they were closing in. The DA herself was in attendance, playing up the affair's tragic angle, hoping the jury would see me as a possessive man pushed to violence. But they'd made one mistake. This diary may have exposed the affair, but it showed her torn between two men. Elaine's entries, though raw, revealed she'd been planning to end things with Moreno the very night they vanished. They had waited too long to leave, and the evidence they so desperately needed could just as easily absolve me. As I listened to her private confessions, her final words tore through me. "Tomorrow, I'll end things with Paul. Bruce deserves better than this." But here I was, fighting for my life against a case held together by gossip, assumptions, and an affair I'd already discovered before she disappeared. Yet the pieces were falling into place. I'd set my defense, knowing that while they had the tragic love story, I had something better, the truth. All I needed was one more witness to make their case unravel. The day I'd been waiting for finally arrived. As the prosecution grew more confident, convinced they had me pegged, I called my own witness to the stand, Jake Trumbull, a private investigator and former FBI agent with a background in counter-surveillance. Jake wasn't just any witness. He was the one person who knew exactly what the police had done in their desperate attempt to pin this on me. Trumbull had been working for me long before this nightmare began, setting up discreet security systems to watch my house and office. We'd nicknamed the setup Black Cover because it was designed to monitor without anyone knowing it existed. Cameras hidden inside, outside, even covering the property perimeter. Everything that happened around my home was recorded, every visit, every intrusion. When Jake took the stand, he exuded calm professionalism, listing his credentials for the jury. The prosecutor tried to downplay his expertise, but Jake was unshakable. I was hired to set up and maintain video surveillance on the defendant's property, he stated, looking directly at the jury. These cameras captured everything that happened around his house. The prosecution looked tense, and I allowed myself a small, inward smile. They hadn't counted on this. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Jake produced a set of tapes as evidence, accompanied by a report. These recordings show that law enforcement accessed Mr. Gray's home without a warrant and tampered with the evidence. Here, on video, is Sergeant McVeigh using a crowbar to break open the trunk of Mr. Gray's car and planting trace materials inside. The courtroom buzzed with shock. The prosecutor objected, but the judge allowed the evidence, and the jury watched as video footage clearly showed McVeigh rummaging through my car, carrying what looked suspiciously like the samples they'd later claim as evidence of my wife and Moreno's presence in the trunk. The damning footage kept rolling, and by the time it was done, the prosecution's case had crumbled. The jury could no longer trust the evidence presented against me, and the once sensational love triangle the DA had spun now looked like a hasty setup. The prosecution had been so eager to convict that they hadn't hesitated to cross every line. When the not guilty verdict came, I didn't react outwardly, but inside, I felt a surge of vindication. My daughter, Rachel, was waiting for me outside the courthouse, and as I hugged her, I knew she had never doubted my innocence. I'd won my freedom, but I also knew that the doubts, the whispers, and the suspicions would linger for years. The media called it a scandal, claiming I'd beaten the system, and in a way, I had. But it was their own overreach, their eagerness to frame me, that had set me free. I had outlasted them, survived, and while my wife and her lover were gone, the truth had saved me. With the trial behind me, I was free in the legal sense, but the weight of it all remained. The media latched onto my story, casting me as either a cunning mastermind who outsmarted the law or as a tragic anti-hero who'd survived a baseless witch hunt. I became infamous, a name that sparked controversy and debate. People believed what they wanted to believe, and it didn't matter how much evidence had cleared me, the accusations would always linger, shadowing every room I walked into. Returning to the remnants of my old life was strange, almost surreal. My house, wrecked by the police search, stood empty and hollow. I sold it quickly, unable to stomach the memories that haunted every room. I moved to a quieter place, kept a low profile, and took on only a few selective cases. Ironically, the scandal surrounding my acquittal brought in more clients than ever, people drawn to the lawyer who got away with it, the man who could supposedly work miracles in the courtroom. Meanwhile, I spent my nights at a new bar, away from prying eyes, where lawyers and the local regulars respected my privacy. I'd sit at the end of the counter, nursing a drink and reflecting on how drastically my life had changed. A handful of old friends stayed loyal, even if their sympathy was tainted by their own questions about my innocence. I didn't bother to explain myself to them. I'd learned that people see only what they want to see. The most difficult part was finding some way to rebuild my relationship with my daughter, Rachel. She had stood by me throughout, never wavering, despite the things people whispered about her father. Our bond was my one lifeline, and in her eyes, I was still the man who had raised her, the father who had taught her right from wrong. I clung to that, grateful that I hadn't lost everything. As the years went by, I made my peace with the doubts that people held about me. The love triangle, the diary, the tragic ending, all of it had turned my life into a public spectacle, a modern myth. But I'd come to understand that survival wasn't about clearing my name, it was about accepting that I couldn't change people's minds. So I moved forward, unburdened by the need for anyone else's approval. In the end, I had outlasted them all, the police, the prosecution, the scandal-hungry media. And while some would always believe I was guilty, I knew the truth. My life was far from perfect, but I was alive, still standing, and in this world, survival was the closest thing to victory I could hope for.